A farmhouse erupted in flames. Hours later, detectives realized the arsonist had murdered the elderly couple first. The amber glow of sunset painted the cornfields of rural Illinois in deceptive tranquility on the evening of April 30th, 1995. Margaret and Keith Miller, both in their 70s, were settling into their usual Saturday routine at their farmhouse on the outskirts of Delavan, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Margaret was preparing her famous apple pie for Sunday's church social, while Keith watched the evening news from his worn leather recliner, the same chair where he'd sat every night for the past 15 years since retiring from his job at the grain elevator. At 11:47 p.m., their peaceful existence would end in flames and horror, marking the beginning of a killing spree that would terrorize the American Midwest and expose the devastating inadequacies of rural law enforcement cooperation. The man responsible would move like a ghost through small farming communities, leaving behind charred houses and brutalized couples. His methodology so precise and his psychological profile so elusive that investigators would later describe him as one of the most calculating serial killers in modern American history. Paul Edward Runge was 32 years old when he first killed, though the seeds of his violence had been planted decades earlier in the cramped trailer parks and broken homes of his childhood. Born in 1963 in Rockford, Illinois, to an alcoholic father who worked sporadically in construction and a mother who cleaned houses for wealthier families, Runge's early years were marked by poverty, instability, and the kind of domestic violence that neighbors whispered about but never reported to authorities. His father, Robert Runge, was a man whose fists spoke louder than his words, particularly after his nightly communion with cheap whiskey. Police records from the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department show 17 domestic disturbance calls to the Runge residence between 1968 and 1975, though charges were never filed, a reflection of an era when domestic violence was considered a private family matter rather than a crime. Young Paul learned early that power came through intimidation and that violence was an acceptable means of control. The psychological architecture of a killer is rarely built from a single traumatic event, but rather constructed from countless small brutalities, each one hardening the foundation until empathy becomes impossible and human life loses all value. For Paul Runge, that construction began when he was 7 years old and witnessed his father sexually assault his 12-year-old sister, Linda, in the family's trailer while their mother worked a late shift at the hospital. When Paul tried to intervene, his father beat him so severely that he required 12 stitches at Rockford Memorial Hospital, injuries that were explained to medical staff as the result of a bicycle accident. Linda Runge never spoke publicly about her abuse until 2003, 8 years after her brother's arrest, when she finally found the courage to testify before a victims' rights advocacy group in Springfield. Her words, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, would provide crucial insight into the psychological formation of one of America's most methodical killers. Paul changed after that night. He stopped trying to protect me, stopped trying to protect anyone. It was like something inside him just died. He became cold, calculating. Even as a kid, he would plan elaborate revenge schemes against neighborhood bullies, waiting months for the perfect moment to strike back. He never forgot a slight, never forgave a wrong. By adolescence, Runge had developed the superficial charm and manipulative intelligence that would later make him so dangerous. Teachers at Jefferson High School remember him as a quiet but bright student who excelled in mathematics and showed particular aptitude for chemistry, skills that would prove deadly in his later crimes. He was never the class clown or the popular athlete, but rather the observer, the one who watched from the margins, cataloguing weaknesses and studying human behavior with the detached fascination of a scientist examining laboratory specimens. His first arrest came at 17 for arson, burning down an abandoned barn belonging to a farmer who had refused to hire him for summer work. The incident revealed an early pattern that would define his later crimes. The use of fire as both weapon and signature, the careful planning that left minimal evidence, and the selection of victims who had somehow wronged or rejected him. The charges were reduced to vandalism after the farmer agreed not to press for full prosecution, a decision that would haunt investigators decades later as they traced the evolution of Runge's criminal methodology. After high school, Runge drifted through a series of jobs: construction worker, gas station attendant, security guard, never staying anywhere long enough to form meaningful relationships or attract sustained attention from employers or co-workers. He lived alone in a series of rented rooms and studio apartments, maintaining the facade of normalcy while privately nurturing fantasies of power and revenge that grew more elaborate and violent with each passing year. The transformation from petty criminal to serial killer might have continued indefinitely had Runge not suffered a series of personal and professional setbacks in the late 1980s spring of 1995. His mother died of liver failure in March, taking with her the last tenuous connection to conventional morality that might have restrained his violent impulses. His job at a chemical plant in Rockford ended in April when he was caught stealing laboratory equipment, materials that investigators would later realize he was stockpiling for use in his crimes. Most significantly, a woman he had been pursuing romantically, a nurse named Patricia Caldwell, had obtained a restraining order against him after he had stalked her for several months, leaving gifts at her apartment and showing up uninvited at her workplace. The psychological pressure of these cumulative rejections and failures created what forensic psychiatrists would later identify as a triggering cascade, a series of stressful events that pushed an already unstable individual past the threshold of legal and moral restraint. For Paul Runge, that threshold was crossed on the evening of April 30th, 1995, when he drove his stolen pickup truck down the gravel road leading to the Miller farmhouse, a location he had chosen not randomly, but through careful surveillance and planning. Margaret and Keith Miller represented everything that Runge believed had been denied to him: stability, respectability, community acceptance, and the kind of quiet contentment that comes from a life well lived. They had been married for 48 years, raised 3 children who had gone on to successful careers in other states, and were pillars of the Delavan Methodist Church. Their farmhouse, a modest but well-maintained structure built in 1952, sat on 80 acres of corn and soybean fields that Keith had worked with the same meticulous care he applied to everything in his life. Runge had first noticed the couple 3 weeks earlier while driving through Delavan on his way to a job interview in Springfield. He had stopped at Miller's roadside produce stand, where Margaret was selling early spring vegetables and homemade preserves. The interaction was brief and seemingly insignificant. He purchased a jar of strawberry jam and exchanged pleasantries about the weather, but it planted the seed for what would become his first murders. In Margaret's kindness and Keith's trusting nature, Runge saw vulnerability that could be exploited, isolation that would work to his advantage, and an opportunity to exercise the kind of absolute power over life and death that had become his primary obsession. The methodical planning that preceded the Miller murders would become Runge's signature, distinguishing him from impulsive killers who struck in moments of passion or opportunity. Over the 3 weeks following his initial encounter with the couple, he conducted what amounted to a military-style reconnaissance operation. He drove past their farmhouse at different times of day, noting their routines and habits. He learned that Keith took a walk to check on his livestock every evening at sunset, that Margaret hung laundry on the line behind the house on Monday mornings, and that their nearest neighbour lived more than half a mile away, far enough that screams would go unheard. Most importantly, he discovered that the couple's telephone line ran along a series of wooden poles that were easily accessible from the road, making it simple to cut their connection to the outside world. This attention to detail, this careful neutralization of potential obstacles, demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that would make Runge nearly impossible to catch and would allow him to operate undetected across multiple states for more than 2 years. On the night of April 30th, Runge parked his truck in a grove of trees approximately 200 yards from the Miller farmhouse and approached on foot, carrying a duffel bag containing duct tape, rope, a hunting knife, matches, and a gallon container of gasoline stolen from a construction site earlier that week. He had disabled the telephone line at 10:15 p.m., cutting the wires with bolt cutters, and then waiting in the darkness for more than an hour to ensure that his sabotage had gone unnoticed. The front door of the farmhouse was unlocked, a testament to the trusting nature of rural communities where crime was rare and neighbours looked out for one another. Runge entered silently, moving through the darkened rooms with the confidence of someone who had studied the layout during his surveillance operations. He found Keith first, asleep in the master bedroom, and subdued him with chloroform-soaked cloth before the elderly farmer could cry out or resist. Margaret awoke to find her husband unconscious and a masked stranger standing beside their bed, but her screams were muffled by Runge's hand and then silenced permanently by the chloroform. What happened next would be reconstructed by forensic investigators through physical evidence, autopsy results, and Runge's own detailed confessions during his 1997 interrogation. The methodical nature of his crimes, the careful binding of victims, the systematic sexual assault of female victims while their husbands were forced to watch, the precise application of torture techniques designed to maximize pain while prolonging life, revealed a level of sadistic sophistication that horrified even veteran homicide investigators. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the forensic pathologist who performed the Miller autopsies, would later testify that the victims had been kept alive for approximately 3 hours after Runge's initial attack. The torture was not random or frenzied, but carefully orchestrated, with medical knowledge applied to ensure that neither victim would lose consciousness or die prematurely. Margaret Miller's injuries indicated that she had been raped repeatedly while Keith was forced to watch, bound and gagged, but conscious. Both victims showed defensive wounds that suggested they had been given brief opportunities to fight back, moments of false hope that were designed to intensify their psychological torment. The murders themselves were committed with clinical precision. Keith Miller died from a single stab wound to the heart, delivered with surgical accuracy to ensure rapid blood loss and immediate cardiac arrest. Margaret Miller was strangled with a ligature fashioned from electrical cord, the pressure applied and released multiple times before the final, fatal compression. The positioning of the bodies, Keith arranged in his favourite chair, Margaret placed beside him with her hand resting on his shoulder, suggested a perverse attempt to recreate the domestic tranquility that Runge had observed during his surveillance. But it was the fire that became Runge's true signature, the element that would link him to 6 subsequent murders across 3 states. The accelerant was applied with scientific precision, creating burn patterns that would maximize structural damage while ensuring the complete destruction of forensic evidence. The blaze began in the basement, where Runge had poured gasoline along the foundation walls and ignited it with a delayed fuse made from newspaper and matches, a technique that gave him ample time to escape before the flames reached the main floor. The Miller farmhouse burned for 4 hours before volunteer firefighters from Delavan could respond, and by then the structure was reduced to smouldering ruins. The remote location and the delayed discovery of the fire meant that crucial evidence was destroyed, leaving investigators with little more than dental records to identify the victims and scant physical evidence to suggest that the deaths were anything other than a tragic accident. It was Margaret Miller's sister, Dorothy Hayes, who first raised suspicions about the fire. Hayes, a retired schoolteacher from Springfield, had spoken with Margaret by telephone on the evening of April 30th, just 2 hours before the estimated time of Runge's attack. During that conversation, Margaret had mentioned feeling uneasy about a man who had been asking questions about their farm at the local gas station, describing him as polite but somehow wrong, like he was wearing a mask, even though his face was showing. Hayes contacted the Tazewell County Sheriff's Department on May 3rd, 3 days after the fire, and insisted that investigators treat her sister's death as a homicide rather than an accident. Her persistence led to a more thorough examination of the crime scene, where investigators found several crucial pieces of evidence that had survived the blaze. Fragments of rope and duct tape in the basement debris, cut telephone wires that showed tool marks inconsistent with fire damage, and tire impressions in the soft earth near the grove where Runge had parked his truck. The investigation into the Miller murders was assigned to Detective Lieutenant Robert Kellerman, a 23-year veteran of the Illinois State Police who had worked dozens of homicide cases, but none involving this level of premeditation and sadistic violence. Kellerman, a methodical investigator known for his attention to detail and his ability to work complex cases across multiple jurisdictions, would spend the next 2 years pursuing leads that seemed to evaporate as quickly as they appeared. The first break in the case came 6 weeks later, when Runge struck again in rural Missouri. On June 15, 1995, the bodies of James and Patricia Thornton were discovered in the ruins of their farmhouse outside Humansville, a small community in Polk County. The similarities to the Miller murders were unmistakable. An elderly couple found dead in their burned home, evidence of sexual assault and torture, and the same methodical application of accelerant that had destroyed crucial forensic evidence. Detective Kellerman traveled to Missouri to consult with local investigators and immediately recognized the signature elements that linked the two crimes. The positioning of the bodies, the specific type of knots used in the rope bindings, and the distinctive burn patterns all suggested the same perpetrator. More importantly, both crime scenes showed evidence of extensive pre-planning and surveillance, indicating that the killer was selecting his victims carefully and studying their routines before striking. The Thornton murders had been discovered more quickly than those of the Millers, allowing investigators to preserve additional forensic evidence. Tire impressions found near the crime scene matched those from the Miller farm, and trace amounts of the same accelerant were identified in both locations. Perhaps most significantly, a witness reported seeing a dark-colored pickup truck with Illinois license plates parked near the Thornton property on the morning before the murders, the first concrete lead that would eventually point investigators toward Paul Runge. As summer turned to autumn, the killer's psychological needs appeared to intensify, with shorter intervals between attacks and increasingly brutal treatment of his victims. On September 23, 1995, Harold and Betty Washington were found dead in their burned home near Macomb, Illinois, making them the third elderly couple to fall victim to what investigators now recognized as a serial killer. The Washington murders showed an escalation in violence that suggested the perpetrator was becoming more confident and more sadistic with each attack. Betty Washington, 74 years old and confined to a wheelchair following a stroke 2 years earlier, had been subjected to particularly horrific abuse before her death. The autopsy revealed that she had been sexually assaulted and tortured for an estimated 4 hours, while her husband Harold was forced to watch from across the room where he had been bound to a chair. The psychological cruelty of forcing Harold to witness his wife's suffering represented a new dimension of sadism that horrified investigators and suggested that the killer was deriving increasing pleasure from the psychological torment of his victims. The Washington crime scene also provided investigators with their first substantial physical evidence. A partial fingerprint was recovered from a piece of duct tape that had survived the fire, and DNA evidence was extracted from biological material found on Betty Washington's clothing. This forensic breakthrough gave investigators the tools they needed to identify their suspect, if they could find him. Detective Kellerman expanded his investigation to include similar crimes across the Midwest, coordinating with law enforcement agencies in 6 states and establishing a task force dedicated to tracking what the media had begun calling the farmhouse killer. The task force included FBI behavioral analysts who developed a comprehensive psychological profile of the perpetrator, describing him as a white male between the ages of 25 and 40, likely with a history of domestic violence and sexual assault, and possessing technical knowledge of accelerants and fire behavior. The profile also suggested that the killer was mobile, possibly working in a job that required travel, and that he was selecting victims based on specific criteria rather than killing randomly. The targeting of elderly couples in isolated rural locations indicated that the perpetrator was seeking victims who would be easy to overpower and unlikely to be discovered quickly, maximizing his time to commit his crimes and escape detection. On December 8, 1995, the killer struck again, this time in Indiana. Carl and Rose Hendricks, both in their late 60s, were found dead in their burned farmhouse near Vincennes. The crime scene bore all the hallmarks of the previous murders: evidence of torture and sexual assault, methodical application of accelerant, and the same distinctive positioning of the victims' bodies. However, the Hendricks murders also marked the first significant mistake that would eventually lead to Runge's capture. A neighbor, walking his dog along the rural road that passed the Hendricks property, had noticed a pickup truck parked in an unusual location on the afternoon before the murders. The witness, a retired police officer named Thomas Bradley, had the presence of mind to note the truck's license plate number and description, providing investigators with their first concrete lead to the killer's identity. The license plate traced back to a 1987 Chevrolet pickup truck registered to Paul Edward Runge of Rockford, Illinois. When investigators ran Runge's name through criminal databases, they discovered his previous arrest for arson and a pattern of employment in jobs that required travel throughout the Midwest, exactly matching the geographical distribution of the murders. Detective Kellerman obtained a warrant to search Runge's apartment in Rockford, but when officers arrived at the address on December 15, 1995, they found it empty. Runge had disappeared, taking with him only essential belongings and leaving behind a sparse living space that revealed little about his personality or motivations. However, investigators did discover several crucial pieces of evidence: road maps with the murder locations circled in red ink, newspaper clippings about the crimes, and a collection of photographs showing various rural farmhouses, potential future targets that suggested Runge's killing spree was far from over. The discovery of Runge's identity and his subsequent disappearance triggered a massive manhunt that involved law enforcement agencies across multiple states. His photograph was distributed to police departments, sheriff's offices, and state patrol units throughout the Midwest, and a federal warrant was issued charging him with unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. The FBI added Runge to its 10 most wanted list, and substantial rewards were offered for information leading to his capture. But Paul Runge had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, demonstrating the same meticulous planning and attention to detail that had characterized his murders. He had withdrawn his modest savings in cash, abandoned his registered vehicle in favor of stolen transportation, and adopted a lifestyle of constant movement that made him nearly impossible to track. For nearly 8 months, Runge remained a ghost, moving through small towns and rural communities across the American heartland, while law enforcement agencies struggled to predict his next move. The investigation consumed enormous resources and involved hundreds of officers, but the killer's mobility and careful operational security made him virtually untraceable. The psychological pressure of living as a fugitive, however, appeared to intensify Runge's violent impulses rather than suppress them. On August 14, 1996, he struck again in Nebraska, murdering Robert and Helen Crawford in their farmhouse near Hastings. The Crawford murders showed an escalation in brutality that suggested Runge was losing whatever limited self-control had previously restrained his sadistic impulses. Helen Crawford, 68 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, was subjected to torture that lasted nearly 6 hours according to forensic estimates. The methodical nature of her abuse, carefully calculated to cause maximum pain while prolonging consciousness, revealed a level of sadistic sophistication that horrified even experienced investigators. Robert Crawford, 71, and in poor health due to diabetes, was forced to watch his wife's torture while bound to a chair, dying of an apparent heart attack before Runge could kill him directly. The Crawford crime scene provided investigators with additional forensic evidence, including DNA samples and fingerprints that confirmed Runge's identity as the perpetrator. More importantly, witnesses reported seeing a man matching Runge's description, asking questions about the Crawford property at a local farm supply store 2 days before the murders, indicating that he was continuing his pattern of surveillance and pre-planning despite the massive manhunt. The final murders in Runge's killing spree occurred on March 18, 1997, in Kansas. Thomas and Martha Coleman, both 73 years old, were found dead in their burned farmhouse near Salina, bringing Runge's confirmed victim count to 14 people across 7 separate incidents. The Coleman murders would prove to be his last, not because of any change in his psychological state, but because of a crucial error in judgment that would finally lead to his capture. After killing the Colemans and setting fire to their home, Runge made the mistake of stopping at a truck stop in Hays, Kansas, where he was recognized by a waitress who had seen his photograph on a wanted poster. The waitress, Nancy Patterson, discreetly called police while continuing to serve Runge coffee, keeping him occupied until officers could arrive. The arrest was made without incident, ending one of the most extensive manhunts in Midwest law enforcement history. Runge's confession, delivered over the course of 3 days of interrogation in March 1997, provided investigators with a detailed account of his crimes that confirmed their worst fears about his level of premeditation and sadistic pleasure. He described each murder with clinical detachment, focusing on the technical aspects of his methodology while showing no remorse for his victims' suffering. His only regret, he told investigators, was that he had been caught before completing what he described as his life's work. The psychological evaluation conducted during Runge's pre-trial detention revealed a complex personality structure that combined high intelligence with complete absence of empathy. Dr. Sarah Whitman, the forensic psychiatrist who examined him, described Runge as a textbook psychopath who viewed other human beings as objects to be manipulated and destroyed for his personal gratification. His crimes, she concluded, were not crimes of passion or desperation, but rather the methodical expression of a fundamentally disordered personality that derived pleasure from causing suffering. Paul Edward Runge was convicted on 14 counts of first-degree murder in November 1997 and sentenced to death in Illinois, Missouri, and Kansas, 3 states that imposed capital punishment for his crimes. He remains on death row at Tams Correctional Center in Illinois, where he has spent the past 26 years filing appeals and maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming physical evidence and his own detailed confessions. The Runge case fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies investigate serial crimes across jurisdictional boundaries, leading to improved information sharing protocols and the development of specialized task forces designed to track mobile killers. The forensic techniques pioneered during the investigation, particularly the analysis of accelerant patterns and the coordination of DNA evidence across multiple crime scenes, became standard procedures that have since been used to solve dozens of similar cases. For the families of Runge's victims, however, no procedural improvements or investigative advances can restore what was lost during those terrible 23 months between April 1995 and March 1997. 14 elderly Americans, people who had lived full lives and contributed to their communities, died in circumstances of unimaginable horror, because one man's psychological disorders had transformed him into a predator of extraordinary cunning and cruelty. The small farming communities where Runge committed his crimes have never fully recovered from the trauma of his attacks. The sense of safety and trust that had characterized rural life for generations was shattered, replaced by locked doors, security systems, and the constant awareness that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places. The farmhouses where his victims lived and died have been demolished, their foundations filled and returned to agricultural use, but the psychological scars remain visible in the heightened security measures and lingering suspicion that now characterize communities once known for their openness and hospitality. Paul Runge's story serves as a chilling reminder that the capacity for evil exists within the human species, in forms that can remain hidden for decades before exploding into violence that destroys not only individual lives, but entire communities' sense of security and trust. His crimes represent the darkest expression of human cruelty, calculated and methodical acts of sadism that reveal the terrifying potential that exists when intelligence is combined with complete absence of conscience. As he continues to await execution more than a quarter century after his capture, Paul Runge remains unrepentant, spending his days in solitary confinement, reading technical manuals and maintaining detailed journals that investigators fear may contain additional confessions to crimes that remain unsolved. The man who once terrorized the American Midwest continues to cast a shadow over the communities he devastated, a reminder that some forms of evil are so profound that they leave permanent scars on the collective memory of those who survived their passage. Status as of 2025. Paul David Runge remains on Illinois' death row at Pontiac Correctional Center. The Illinois Supreme Court affirmed his convictions and death sentence in 2017, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined review the same year. Because Illinois has had a de facto moratorium on executions since 2003, no execution date has been set, leaving Runge to exhaust his appeals from behind bars. The Starvation Doctor, Linda Hazard's deadly cure. The morning fog clung to the shores of Puget Sound like a shroud on May 19, 1911, when sisters Claire and Dorothea Williamson arrived at the remote sanitarium in Olalla, Washington. The English heiresses, seeking relief from minor digestive ailments, had no way of knowing they were walking into the carefully constructed web of America's most calculating serial killer, a woman who would systematically starve them while convincing them it was for their own good. Dr. Linda Laura Hazard stood waiting at the entrance of her so-called Institute of Natural Therapeutics, her gaunt frame draped in flowing white robes that gave her the appearance of some macabre angel of mercy. At 44, Hazard possessed the kind of magnetic authority that could convince the desperate and wealthy to surrender their lives and their fortunes to her revolutionary fasting cure. Her pale blue eyes burned with evangelical fervor as she welcomed the sisters, promising them health through hunger, vitality through voluntary starvation. What the Williamson sisters couldn't have imagined was that they were about to become the latest victims in a killing spree that had already claimed more than a dozen lives across the Pacific Northwest. Linda Hazard had perfected the art of murder disguised as medicine, transforming the ancient practice of therapeutic fasting into a systematic method of homicide that would make her both wealthy and notorious in equal measure. Linda Laura Burfield was born in Carver County, Minnesota on December 18, 1867, into a world that offered limited opportunities for ambitious women. The daughter of a farmer, she displayed an early fascination with alternative medicine and an insatiable hunger for authority that would define her entire existence. By the age of 18, she had married Sam Hazard, a man twice her age, who would serve as both enabler and witness to her transformation from small-town housewife to predatory killer. The young Linda's introduction to fasting came through the works of Dr. Edward Hooker Dewey, whose book, The No Breakfast Plan and the Fasting Cure, had gained popularity among health enthusiasts in the 1890s. Where Dewey advocated moderation and medical supervision, Linda saw opportunity. she began developing her own extreme interpretation of fasting therapy, one that would strip away every safeguard and ethical consideration in favor of absolute control over her patients. In 1898, Linda published her manifesto, Fasting for the Cure of Disease, a 120-page tome that outlined her radical approach to healing. The book was part pseudo-scientific treatise, part evangelical sermon, and entirely dangerous. Linda claimed that virtually every human ailment could be cured through prolonged fasting, sometimes lasting up to 50 days or more. She dismissed traditional medicine as poisonous quackery while positioning herself as a visionary who had unlocked the secrets of human health. The timing was perfect. America in the early 1900s was experiencing a wellness revolution, with affluent citizens increasingly suspicious of conventional medicine and drawn to alternative treatments. The wealthy, in particular, were captivated by the promise of exclusive, revolutionary cures that ordinary people couldn't access. Linda understood this psychology intimately and crafted her practice to exploit it with ruthless precision. Moving to Seattle in 1902, Linda established her first treatment facility in a large house on Capitol Hill. She deliberately targeted the wealthy and well-connected, understanding that their deaths would be less likely to trigger immediate suspicion. Her first confirmed victim was a businessman named Eugene Stanley Wacklin, who died in 1902 after weeks of Linda's treatment. The death certificate listed heart failure, but those close to Wacklin knew he had been reduced to a skeletal shadow of his former self before succumbing. Linda's method was diabolically simple, yet psychologically sophisticated. New patients would arrive at her facility seeking treatment for minor ailments, digestive issues, chronic fatigue, or general malaise. Linda would conduct a cursory examination, then declare that the patient's condition was far more serious than previously diagnosed. Only her radical fasting cure, she would insist, could save them from certain death. The treatment began immediately. Patients were allowed no food whatsoever, only small amounts of vegetable broth and water. Linda would monitor their condition closely, not to ensure their safety, but to gauge how long she could extend their suffering without triggering outside intervention. As patients weakened, she would convince them that their deteriorating condition was proof that the cure was working, that their bodies were purging decades of accumulated toxins. The psychological manipulation was as methodical as the physical starvation. Linda presented herself as both doctor and prophet, claiming divine inspiration for her methods. She would sit by patients' bedsides as they wasted away, offering spiritual comfort while systematically dismantling their will to resist. Many patients, weakened beyond the capacity for rational thought, became completely dependent on Linda's approval and guidance. Margaret Conway, a wealthy widow from Portland, became one of Linda's victims in 1906. Conway had sought treatment for what she described as nervous exhaustion following her husband's death. Linda convinced her that only a 40-day fast could restore her mental equilibrium. Conway's adult children became alarmed when their previously robust mother began sending letters describing her dramatic weight loss as a positive development. By the time they arrived in Seattle to check on her, Margaret Conway weighed less than 70 pounds and was barely conscious. The family demanded Conway's immediate release, but Linda had prepared for such contingencies. She had convinced Conway to sign a document granting Linda complete medical authority over her treatment, effectively making the patient a legal prisoner of her own medical care. Conway died 3 days later, her death certificate listing heart failure secondary to exhaustion. Linda inherited nearly $2,000 from Conway's estate, money that Conway had been persuaded to bequeath to her savior in a will revised during her final days. The Conway case established Linda's modus operandi with chilling clarity. She would isolate wealthy patients from their families, convince them to modify their wills in her favor, then slowly starve them to death while maintaining the pretense of medical treatment. Local authorities, largely unfamiliar with the intricacies of alternative medicine, rarely questioned the deaths of patients who had voluntarily sought treatment for existing ailments. By 1908, Linda had accumulated enough wealth to realize her ultimate ambition: a remote sanitarium where she could operate with complete autonomy. She purchased 40 acres of heavily forested land in Olalla, Washington, a tiny community on the western shore of Puget Sound. The location was strategically chosen for its isolation. Patients' families would find it difficult to make unexpected visits, and local authorities were minimal. The Wilderness Heights Sanitarium, as Linda christened her facility, consisted of a main lodge, several smaller cabins, and a peculiar structure she called the fasting cabin, a stark, cell-like building where patients in the final stages of their treatment were housed. Linda surrounded herself with a small staff of devoted followers who had been thoroughly indoctrinated into her philosophy. These assistants, themselves often former patients who had narrowly survived Linda's treatments, served as both caregivers and guards, ensuring that patients couldn't leave without Linda's permission. The sanitarium's guest registry from 1908 to 1911 reads like a catalogue of Linda's victims. Earl Edward Erdman, a businessman from Minneapolis, died after a 38-day fast in March 1909. Ida Wilcox, a Seattle socialite, perished following 45 days without food in August of the same year. Louis Ellsworth Rader, a Portland attorney, succumbed after 53 days of Linda's cure in November 1909, his final will mysteriously altered to leave his entire estate to Linda Hazard. Each death followed the same pattern. Patients would arrive seeking treatment for minor ailments, only to be diagnosed with life-threatening conditions that required immediate and prolonged fasting. As they weakened, Linda would convince them to revise their wills, often claiming that the legal documents were necessary for their continued treatment. Family members who attempted to intervene would be told that removal from treatment would result in the patient's immediate death. Linda's psychological manipulation reached its most sophisticated form in her treatment of the Williamson sisters. Claire, 33, and Dorothea, 36, were wealthy English spinsters who had been traveling through the American West when they learned of Linda's revolutionary treatments. Both women suffered from minor digestive complaints that conventional doctors had been unable to resolve completely. Linda recognized in the sisters the perfect victims: foreign nationals with limited local connections, substantial wealth, and the kind of trusting nature that would make them susceptible to her manipulation. She convinced them that their digestive issues were symptoms of systemic poisoning that would prove fatal without immediate intervention. Only her fasting cure, Linda insisted, could save their lives. The sisters were installed in separate cabins at Wilderness Heights, ostensibly to prevent them from influencing each other's treatment. In reality, Linda understood that isolation would make each woman more dependent on her approval and guidance. Within days of beginning their fast, both sisters were too weak to walk unaided. Linda presented their deteriorating condition as evidence that the cure was working, that their bodies were finally purging the toxins that had been slowly killing them. As the days turned to weeks, the sisters' physical appearance became increasingly alarming. Dorothea, who had weighed 140 pounds upon arrival, had been reduced to less than 60 pounds by the end of her second month at the sanitarium. Her sister Claire, initially the healthier of the two, was wasting away at an equally alarming rate. Both women had signed revised wills, leaving substantial portions of their estates to Linda. Documents that Linda claimed were standard requirements for extended treatment. The sisters' transformation from healthy, independent women to skeletal invalids didn't occur in a vacuum. Linda maintained detailed records of each patient's progress, documenting weight loss, physical symptoms, and psychological state with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting an experiment. These records, later discovered by investigators, revealed the calculated nature of Linda's methods and her complete lack of medical ethics. Margaret Conway's family had hired Seattle attorney Lucian Agassiz to investigate Linda's practices following their mother's death. Agassiz had been quietly building a case against Linda, interviewing former patients who had survived her treatments and documenting the suspicious circumstances surrounding multiple deaths at her facilities. The attorney understood that proving murder would be challenging. Linda's victims had voluntarily sought treatment and had technically died of starvation, not poison or violence. The breakthrough came when Dorothea Williamson, despite her weakened condition, managed to smuggle a letter to a friend in England. The letter, written in a trembling hand that barely resembled Dorothea's usual elegant script, described her deteriorating condition and expressed growing fear about Linda's true motives. The friend immediately contacted British diplomatic authorities, who began their own investigation into the sisters' situation. On May 19, 1911, exactly 2 months after the sisters' arrival at Wilderness Heights, British Vice-Consul Lucian Agassiz arrived at the sanitarium with King County Sheriff's deputies, demanding immediate access to the Williamson sisters. What they found horrified even experienced law enforcement officers. Dorothea weighed barely 50 pounds and was barely conscious, her body so emaciated that every bone was visible through her translucent skin. Claire, though slightly less deteriorated, was clearly dying. Linda initially refused to allow the sisters to leave, claiming that interrupting their treatment would result in their immediate death. She produced the medical authority documents the sisters had signed, insisting that removing them from her care would be tantamount to murder. The legal standoff continued for hours, with Linda alternately threatening lawsuits and pleading that she was only trying to save her patients' lives. The confrontation ended when Dorothea, summoning her last reserves of strength, whispered to the vice-consul that she wanted to leave immediately. Claire, too weak to speak, nodded her agreement. The deputies physically removed both women from the sanitarium over Linda's vehement protests, transporting them to a Seattle hospital, where doctors began the delicate process of refeeding patients who had been systematically starved for months. Dorothea Williamson died 4 days later at Seattle General Hospital, her body too damaged by prolonged starvation to recover. The official cause of death was listed as inanition, a medical term for death by starvation. Claire survived, though she would never fully recover from the physical and psychological trauma of Linda's treatment. Her testimony would prove crucial in the prosecution case against the woman who had nearly killed her. The investigation that followed Dorothea's death revealed the full scope of Linda's crimes. Detectives discovered that at least 15 people had died under her care since 1902, with many more suffering permanent damage from her treatments. Financial records showed that Linda had inherited money or property from at least 8 of her victims, accumulating wealth that far exceeded what her legitimate medical practice could have generated. The physical evidence was equally damning. Investigators found detailed journals in which Linda had recorded her patients' daily weight loss, noting when they became too weak to resist her suggestions about wills and property transfers. She had photographed some patients during their treatments, creating a visual record of their deterioration that she apparently kept as trophies of her success. Linda's arrest on August 4, 1911, created a sensation in the Seattle press. Newspapers dubbed her the starvation doctor and the human vulture, describing her crimes in terms that shocked readers accustomed to more conventional forms of murder. The case attracted national attention, partly because of the novel nature of Linda's methods and partly because of the social prominence of many of her victims. The trial began on January 15, 1912, in the King County Superior Court. Prosecutor Thomas Morris faced the challenging task of proving that Linda had committed murder through medical treatment that her victims had voluntarily sought. The defense, led by attorney Robert Ballinger, argued that Linda was a legitimate medical practitioner whose patients had died from their underlying illnesses, not from her treatments. Claire Williamson's testimony provided the prosecution's most powerful evidence. Speaking in a voice still weakened by her ordeal, she described how Linda had systematically isolated her and her sister from outside contact, convinced them that their minor ailments were life-threatening conditions, and pressured them to sign legal documents while they were too weak to think clearly. Her account of watching her sister waste away while Linda insisted the treatment was working horrified the jury. The prosecution called expert witnesses who testified that prolonged fasting without medical supervision was inherently dangerous and that Linda's methods violated every established principle of patient care. Dr. Frank Nicholson, a respected Seattle physician, told the jury that the kind of extended fasting Linda prescribed would inevitably result in death for most patients, regardless of their initial health status. Linda's defense strategy relied heavily on her own testimony and that of former patients who claimed to have been cured by her treatments. She presented herself as a medical pioneer whose revolutionary methods were being suppressed by a jealous medical establishment. Linda insisted that her patients had died from their underlying diseases, not from her treatments, and that she had only tried to help them when conventional medicine had failed. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with both sides presenting extensive medical testimony about the effects of prolonged fasting on human health. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of manslaughter in the death of Claire Williamson. Linda was sentenced to 2 to 20 years in the Washington State Penitentiary at Walla Walla. Linda served barely 2 years of her sentence before being released on parole in December 1915. Her early release was the result of intensive lobbying by supporters who continued to believe in her methods and political connections that Linda had cultivated during her years of practice. Upon her release, she immediately began planning her return to medical practice, seemingly oblivious to the public outrage her crimes had generated. The aftermath of Linda's trial revealed systemic failures in medical regulation and patient protection that had enabled her crimes. Washington State had no licensing requirements for alternative medical practitioners, allowing Linda to operate without oversight or accountability. The legal system provided few protections for patients who voluntarily sought treatment, even when that treatment was clearly harmful. Linda's case prompted significant reforms in medical regulation and patient protection laws. Washington State implemented licensing requirements for all medical practitioners, regardless of their methods, and established oversight mechanisms to investigate complaints against healthcare providers. Other states followed suit, creating a legal framework that made it much more difficult for practitioners like Linda to operate with impunity. The psychological profile that emerged from Linda's trial revealed a complex individual who combined genuine belief in her methods with calculated exploitation of vulnerable patients. Mental health experts who studied her case noted her narcissistic personality traits, her need for absolute control over others, and her ability to rationalize clearly harmful behavior as beneficial to her victims. Linda's relationship with her husband Sam provided additional insight into her psychology. Throughout her criminal career, Sam had served as both enabler and witness to her crimes, helping to manage the sanitarium and providing emotional support for Linda's increasingly extreme behavior. Their marriage represented a partnership in exploitation, with Sam handling the business aspects of Linda's practice, while she focused on the manipulation and control of patients. The impact of Linda's crimes extended far beyond her immediate victims. Families of those who died under her care were left to grapple with questions about their loved ones' final days and their own failure to intervene more effectively. The broader alternative medicine community faced increased scrutiny and regulation, as Linda's case highlighted the potential for abuse within unregulated therapeutic practices. Claire Williamson's survival and testimony provided a rare first-hand account of Linda's methods from a victim's perspective. Her description of the psychological manipulation that accompanied the physical starvation revealed the sophisticated nature of Linda's approach to controlling her patients. Claire's account helped investigators understand how Linda had managed to convince so many intelligent, wealthy individuals to submit to treatment that would ultimately kill them. Following her release from prison, Linda attempted to rebuild her practice, first in Seattle and later in other states where her reputation was less well known. However, increased medical regulation and public awareness of her crimes made it impossible for her to operate openly. She spent her final years moving from place to place, attempting to practice her version of medicine under assumed names and false credentials. Linda Hazzard died in 1938 at the age of 70, reportedly while undergoing her own fasting treatment. A final irony in a life dedicated to the belief that starvation could cure any ailment. Her death marked the end of one of America's most unusual serial killing careers, but her case continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated medical practice and the vulnerability of patients seeking hope from charismatic practitioners. The legacy of Linda Hazzard's crimes extends beyond their immediate impact on victims and families. Her case represents an early example of medical serial killing, predating more famous cases like Harold Shipman by nearly a century. The methodical nature of her crimes, the psychological manipulation she employed, and her ability to operate openly for nearly a decade provide valuable insights into the psychology of serial killers who use positions of trust and authority to victimize others. Modern criminal profilers studying Linda's case have identified several key factors that enabled her crimes: the lack of medical regulation in early 20th century America, the social status that protected her from immediate suspicion, and the psychological vulnerability of patients seeking alternative treatments for chronic conditions. These factors combined to create an environment in which Linda could operate with relative impunity, systematically murdering patients while maintaining the facade of medical practice. The Williamson sisters' story, in particular, illustrates the international dimension of Linda's crimes and the challenges faced by foreign nationals seeking medical treatment abroad. Their deaths prompted diplomatic discussions about protecting citizens traveling overseas for medical care and highlighted the need for international cooperation in medical regulation and patient protection. Linda Hazzard's transformation from small-town housewife to calculating serial killer demonstrates the dangerous potential of unchecked authority, combined with narcissistic personality traits and genuine belief in harmful ideologies. Her case serves as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who convince themselves that their harmful actions serve a higher purpose, allowing them to commit terrible crimes while maintaining their own sense of righteousness and moral superiority. The physical evidence from Linda's crimes, the detailed journals documenting patients' deterioration, the photographs of emaciated victims, and the financial records showing her systematic exploitation of dying patients, provides a chilling record of one woman's descent into systematic murder. These documents, preserved in court records and investigative files, continue to serve as primary source material for researchers studying the psychology of medical serial killers and the evolution of patient protection laws. The story of Linda Hazzard and her victims represents more than just another true crime narrative. It serves as a case study in the intersection of medicine, psychology, law, and social policy. Her crimes exposed fundamental weaknesses in the systems designed to protect vulnerable individuals and prompted reforms that continue to influence medical practice and regulation today. The legacy of her victims lives on in the legal protections and regulatory frameworks that their deaths helped to create, ensuring that future patients would have greater protection from those who would exploit their trust and vulnerability for personal gain. The literary killer, Jack Unterweger's double life. The snow fell silently on Vienna's cobblestone streets on June 29, 1994, as Jack Unterweger sat in his prison cell, methodically fashioning a noose from his bed sheets. The man who had charmed Austria's literary elite, who had walked red carpets and appeared on talk shows as a reformed murderer turned celebrated author, was about to complete the final chapter of perhaps the most audacious criminal deception in modern European history. In just hours, guards would find his body hanging from the window bars, dead by his own hand. The same hands that had strangled at least 11 women across 2 continents. But this ending had been written decades earlier in the squalid back alleys of post-war Austria, where a boy named Johann Unterweger first learned that violence could be a form of expression and manipulation could be refined into an art form. The story begins not with murder, but with abandonment. Born on August 16, 1950, in the small Austrian town of Judenburg, Johann, who would later reinvent himself as Jack, entered a world that seemed designed to create monsters. His mother, Theresia Unterweger, was an unmarried barmaid whose reputation in the conservative Alpine community was already tarnished. His father was an American soldier who had vanished into the post-war chaos, leaving behind only the blue eyes and angular features that would later make Jack devastatingly attractive to women. Theresia, overwhelmed and ostracized, made a decision that would echo through decades of violence. She abandoned her infant son to her own mother, a woman whose cruelty was legendary even in a community accustomed to harsh discipline. Jack's grandmother, a bitter alcoholic who ran a small tavern, viewed the illegitimate child as both burden and target for her rage. She beat him regularly, locked him in dark cellars for hours, and subjected him to psychological torments that would have broken most children completely. By age 10, Jack had learned to survive through cunning and charm. He discovered early that his unusual appearance, those striking blue eyes in a face that suggested both vulnerability and danger, could disarm adults who might otherwise see through his increasingly sophisticated lies. Teachers noted his intelligence even as they despaired of his behavior. He would arrive at school with bruises and stories that changed depending on the audience, each tale crafted to elicit maximum sympathy while deflecting uncomfortable questions about his home life. The first signs of his future pathology emerged during adolescence. Neighbors later recalled finding mutilated animals near the family tavern, cats with their necks broken, birds with their wings methodically torn off. When confronted, young Jack would produce such convincing displays of distress and bewilderment that accusations evaporated. He was learning perhaps the most dangerous skill of all, how to make people want to believe him. At 16, Jack committed his first recorded violent crime against a human being. On a frigid December night in 1966, he attacked a woman with a steel rod during a robbery attempt. The savagery of the assault shocked even hardened police officers. The victim survived, but barely, and Jack was sentenced to juvenile detention. It was there, ironically, that he discovered literature. The prison library became his sanctuary and his laboratory. He devoured classic works, Dostoevsky, Kafka, Camus, absorbing not just their artistic techniques, but their psychological insights into criminal minds. He began to understand that his own damaged psyche, rather than being a liability, could be transformed into literary capital. More importantly, he learned that society was fascinated by the reformed criminal, the bad boy who had seen the light and emerged purified through suffering and art. Upon his release in 1968, Jack had already begun constructing the persona that would later deceive an entire nation. He dressed carefully, spoke eloquently about his troubled past and his commitment to redemption, and began writing. His early poems and short stories, raw and powerful, drew on his genuine experiences of abuse and institutional violence. The authenticity of his suffering gave his work an emotional weight that impressed editors and critics who might otherwise have dismissed writings by an ex-convict. But beneath this carefully crafted exterior, darker impulses were growing stronger. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, Jack committed a series of increasingly violent crimes, robberies, assaults, and sexual attacks that demonstrated an escalating need for control and domination. Each arrest was followed by another performance of remorse, another promise of rehabilitation, another demonstration of his literary talents. The pattern was so consistent that it seems, in retrospect, almost algorithmic. Commit violence, express regret, display artistic sensitivity, gain release, repeat. The culmination of this cycle came on December 11th, 1974, when Jack murdered 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer in the woods near Salzburg. The crime was savage in its intimacy. He strangled her with her own bra after what appeared to be a sexual assault. But it was also methodical, planned, executed with the cold precision of someone who had been building toward this moment for years. When police arrested him 3 days later, they found him remarkably calm, almost relieved, as if he had finally achieved something he had long been working toward. The trial that followed provided Jack with his first major stage. Rather than denying the crime or pleading insanity, he crafted a narrative of temporary madness brought on by childhood trauma and social rejection. He spoke eloquently about the cycle of violence that had shaped him, the way society's failures had created the conditions for Margaret Schaefer's death. It was a masterful performance that transformed a cold-blooded killer into a tragic figure worthy of sympathy. The strategy worked, partially. Jack was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, but the court accepted his narrative of diminished responsibility. More importantly for his long-term plans, the literary establishment began to take notice. His poems and stories, smuggled out of prison and published in small journals, were praised for their raw honesty and psychological depth. Critics wrote about the authentic voice of suffering and the redemptive power of art in even the most damaged souls. From his cell in Stein prison, Jack began orchestrating perhaps the most audacious con in Austrian criminal history. He didn't just write, he studied writing, analyzing the techniques that made certain authors compelling and trustworthy. He corresponded with intellectuals, journalists, and social activists, always presenting himself as living proof that even the most lost souls could be saved through literature and human compassion. His breakthrough came in 1984 with the publication of Purgatory, or The Trip to Prison, Report of a Guilty Man. The book was a semi-autobiographical account of his path from abused child to murderer to reformed artist. Written in spare, powerful prose that alternated between brutal self-examination and soaring passages about redemption, it became an immediate sensation. Critics hailed it as a masterwork of prison literature, comparing Jack to Jean Genet and other criminal artists who had transformed their experiences of violence and incarceration into art. But Purgatory was more than just a book. It was an elaborate psychological manipulation designed to secure Jack's release. Every page was calculated to evoke sympathy while demonstrating his supposed transformation. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, a man who had committed terrible acts but had emerged from the darkness through the healing power of literature. The book became required reading in criminology courses and was cited by progressive intellectuals as evidence that rehabilitation was possible even for murderers. The campaign for Jack's release gained momentum throughout the late 1980s. Prominent writers, journalists, and social activists argued that keeping such an obviously reformed man in prison was both cruel and counterproductive. They pointed to his literary output. By 1990, he had published several books and countless articles as proof of his transformation. Television documentaries portrayed him as a symbol of hope, a man who had conquered his demons through art and introspection. What none of these supporters knew was that Jack had been using his time in prison to refine not just his writing skills, but his killing techniques. He had studied anatomy textbooks from the prison library, learning about the precise pressure points that could render a victim unconscious without leaving obvious marks. He had analysed court records and police files, understanding how investigators approach serial murder cases and where they typically made mistakes. Most chillingly, he had spent years fantasizing about the perfect murders he would commit upon his release, crimes that would satisfy his psychological needs, while avoiding the detection methods that had led to his capture in 1974. On May 23, 1990, after serving 15 years of a life sentence, Jack Unterweger walked out of Stein prison as a free man. Cameras flashed as he emerged into the sunlight, elegant in a carefully chosen suit, his now greying hair styled to suggest both dignity and artistic sensitivity. Reporters shouted questions about his plans, his feelings, his message for other prisoners seeking redemption. Jack answered each query with practiced eloquence, speaking about the transformative power of literature and his commitment to helping other troubled souls find their way to the light. Within hours of his release, he was back on the hunting ground. The Austria that welcomed Jack Unterweger in 1990 was a nation in transition. The Cold War was ending, borders were opening, and traditional social structures were evolving rapidly. The sex trade, always present but previously hidden, was becoming more visible and more dangerous. Prostitutes working the streets of Vienna, Graz, and other Austrian cities faced increasing violence from clients who seemed to view them as expendable. When women in this vulnerable population began disappearing or turning up dead, police investigations often lacked the urgency and resources that would have been devoted to victims from other social classes. This institutional indifference created perfect hunting conditions for a predator like Jack, who understood better than anyone how to exploit society's blind spots. He had spent 15 years studying criminal psychology, police procedures, and media coverage of serial crimes. He knew that murders of prostitutes received less attention, generated less public pressure for swift resolution, and were often attributed to the general dangers of street life rather than to organized predatory behavior. Jack's first victim after his release was Blanka Bokova, a 28-year-old Czech prostitute working in Vienna's red light district. On October 26, 1990, 5 months after Jack's triumphant return to society, Blanka's body was found in woods outside the city. She had been strangled with her own stockings, a signature that would become terrifyingly familiar to investigators in the months that followed. But at the time, her death was treated as an isolated incident, another tragedy in the dangerous world of street prostitution. The genius of Jack's post-release strategy lay in his ability to commit murders while simultaneously building an unassailable public persona. During the day, he was Austria's most celebrated reformed criminal, appearing on television talk shows, giving lectures at universities, and writing newspaper columns about crime and punishment. His schedule was packed with public appearances, creating alibis and maintaining his image as a man dedicated to preventing the kind of violence he had once committed. At night, he stalked the streets where society's most vulnerable women worked and died. Heidemarie Hammerer disappeared on New Year's Eve, 1990. The 31-year-old prostitute was last seen getting into a car in Vienna's Prater district. Her body was discovered 3 months later in a wooded area, strangled with her own pantyhose. Like Blanka Bokova, she had been posed in a specific way after death, her clothing arranged with the kind of ritualistic precision that suggested a killer working through deeply held fantasies. Police investigating these crimes faced a peculiar challenge. The murders were clearly connected, but the killer demonstrated an unusually sophisticated understanding of forensic science and criminal investigation techniques. He left no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no witnesses who could provide useful descriptions. The crime scenes were almost textbook examples of how to commit murder without leaving clues, as if the killer had studied police procedures and deliberately crafted his methods to frustrate investigation. What investigators didn't know was that Jack had indeed studied police procedures extensively, both during his imprisonment and after his release. He subscribed to criminology journals attended conferences on forensic science, and maintained correspondence with experts in criminal psychology. To the outside world, this research appeared to be part of his continued education and his work as a crime writer. In reality, it was professional development for his second career as a serial killer. Elfriede Schrempf vanished on March 7, 1991. The 35-year-old prostitute's disappearance followed the same pattern as the previous murders. A woman working alone, last seen getting into a vehicle, found weeks later in a remote location with clear signs of ritualistic strangulation. By this point, Vienna police had formed a task force to investigate what they were beginning to recognize as the work of a serial killer. The investigation was complicated by institutional prejudices that Jack had anticipated and planned to exploit. The victims were all prostitutes, women whose disappearances didn't generate immediate public concern or media attention. Their families, often estranged or living in poverty, lacked the resources and social connections to pressure authorities for swift action. The killer had chosen his victims not just for their vulnerability on the streets, but for their invisibility in the broader social system. Meanwhile, Jack's public profile continued to soar. His second book, The Unrepentant, was published to critical acclaim in early 1991. Television producers competed to book him for interviews and documentaries. He became a regular guest on talk shows, where his articulate discussions of criminal psychology and rehabilitation theory impressed audiences who had no idea they were listening to an active serial killer describe his own methods and motivations. The psychological complexity of Jack's situation during this period defies easy categorization. He wasn't simply a killer masquerading as a reformed man. He genuinely believed in his own literary talents and saw himself as an important voice in discussions of crime and justice. His writings about the criminal mind were insightful precisely because they came from lived experience as both perpetrator and victim of violence. He had developed a dual consciousness that allowed him to simultaneously murder women and write eloquently about the tragedy of violence in society. This duality became even more pronounced when Jack decided to expand his hunting grounds beyond Austria. In June 1991, he convinced a magazine to send him to Los Angeles as a correspondent covering crime stories. The assignment was perfectly suited to his public image as a reformed criminal with unique insights into the criminal mind. What the magazine editors didn't realize was that they were financing a hunting expedition that would bring Jack face to face with one of America's most notorious serial killers. The Los Angeles of 1991 was a city in crisis. The crack epidemic had devastated entire neighborhoods. Gang violence was at historic levels, and dozens of women, particularly those involved in prostitution, were disappearing or turning up murdered. Into this chaos stepped Jack Unterweger, armed with press credentials and a carefully crafted persona as a European journalist researching American crime. Jack's first kill in Los Angeles came within days of his arrival. Shannon Exley, a struggling actress who occasionally worked as a prostitute, was found strangled in her apartment on June 14, 1991. The murder bore all the hallmarks of Jack's European crimes: the ritualistic use of the victim's own clothing as a murder weapon, the careful positioning of the body, the complete absence of forensic evidence. But in a city where multiple serial killers were operating simultaneously, one more dead prostitute barely registered with overwhelmed homicide detectives. What made Jack's American murders particularly chilling was his ability to study and adapt to local conditions while maintaining his signature methods. He researched Los Angeles police procedures, identified areas of the city where prostitutes worked with minimal police protection, and even established contact with LAPD detectives investigating serial crimes. His press credentials gave him access to crime scenes and police briefings, allowing him to gather intelligence that would help him avoid capture while planning future attacks. The psychological pressure of maintaining his double life, celebrated journalist by day, serial killer by night, might have broken a less sophisticated criminal. But Jack thrived on the complexity and danger of his situation. His diary entries from this period reveal a man intoxicated by his own audacity, thrilled by the risk of discovery, and convinced of his intellectual superiority over both the police hunting him and the public that celebrated him. During his 3-week stay in Los Angeles, Jack killed at least 3 women: Shannon Exley, Irene Rodriguez, and Sherry Long. Each murder was more confident than the last, demonstrating his rapid adaptation to new hunting grounds and his growing belief in his own invincibility. He even managed to get quotes from LAPD detectives for his articles about the city's crime problems, reporting on investigations into murders he had committed. Jack's return to Austria in July 1991 was marked by another round of media appearances and public speaking engagements. He wrote extensively about his American experiences, publishing articles that portrayed Los Angeles as a violent, chaotic city where life had little value. His observations about American police procedures and criminal justice systems were praised for their insight and analytical depth. No one suspected that his expertise came from first-hand experience, as both observer and participant in the violence he described. But success was breeding recklessness. The murders resumed in Austria with increased frequency and boldness. Sylvia Zagler disappeared in August 1991, followed by Sabine Moitzi in October. Each crime scene revealed the killer's growing confidence and his contempt for the investigators pursuing him. He was no longer content to simply avoid capture. He wanted to demonstrate his intellectual superiority over the police, leaving subtle clues and patterns that showed his sophistication while remaining just beyond their reach. The breakthrough in the investigation came not through brilliant detective work, but through the kind of bureaucratic coincidence that Jack had never anticipated. A clerical worker processing evidence from the Austrian murders noticed similarities to cases being investigated in Los Angeles. The connection might have been dismissed as coincidence, except for one detail. Both crime scenes featured the same unusual knot pattern in the ligatures used to strangle the victims. Detective Inspector August Schenner, the Austrian investigator leading the Vienna task force, began corresponding with LAPD detectives about the possible connection. What they discovered was extraordinary. The dates of the Los Angeles murders corresponded exactly to Jack Unterweger's visit to the city. Moreover, all the American victims had been found in areas that Jack had written about in his published articles. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Jack's deception. Phone records showed calls from his hotel to escort services used by the victims. Credit card receipts placed him near several of the crime scenes. Most damning of all, fiber evidence linked him to multiple murders on both continents. The famous reformed murderer, the literary sensation who had charmed Austria's intellectual elite, was revealed to be one of the most prolific serial killers in European history. The arrest came on February 27, 1992, as Jack was having lunch at an upscale Vienna restaurant with a prominent journalist who was interviewing him for yet another profile. Police surrounded the establishment, creating a scene that would have been fitting for one of Jack's own literary works. As handcuffs were placed on his wrists, he reportedly smiled and told the arresting officers, "You took long enough." The trial that began in April 1994 was a media sensation that gripped Austria and much of Europe. Here was a man who had successfully deceived an entire nation, who had turned his own criminal history into literary capital while using that fame to facilitate new crimes. The courtroom was packed with journalists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens trying to understand how they had been so thoroughly manipulated. Jack's defense strategy was as audacious as everything else about his criminal career. He didn't deny being in Los Angeles when the murders occurred, or that he had contact with several of the victims. Instead, he claimed to be the victim of an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by police forces on 2 continents who were embarrassed by their failure to solve the cases. He portrayed himself as a convenient scapegoat, a reformed man whose past made him an easy target for lazy investigators looking to close difficult cases. The performance was masterful, combining just enough truth with carefully crafted lies to create reasonable doubt. Jack acknowledged his troubled past while maintaining his innocence of the recent murders. He spoke eloquently about the prejudice faced by ex-convicts and the rush to judgment that occurred when someone with his background was suspected of new crimes. Several character witnesses, including prominent writers and social activists, testified to his apparent rehabilitation and the positive impact of his work. But the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic testimony linked him definitively to multiple crime scenes. His own writings, analysed by linguistic experts, contained details about the murders that only the killer could have known. Most damaging of all, investigators had discovered his diary, filled with detailed fantasies about killing women and explicit descriptions of the murders he had committed. On June 28, 1994, after deliberating for 6 hours, the jury found Jack Unterweger guilty on 11 counts of murder. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, noted that Jack had exploited society's capacity for forgiveness and rehabilitation to facilitate his crimes. "You have not only murdered 11 women," the judge said, "you have murdered the very concept of redemption that allowed your release from prison." That night, alone in his cell, as he awaited transfer to maximum security prison, Jack began his final literary project. Using strips torn from his bedsheets, he crafted a noose with the same methodical precision he had brought to his murders. He left no suicide note, no final explanation or justification. His last act was as carefully planned and executed as all his crimes had been. Guards found his body the next morning, suspended from the window bars of his cell. The man who had strangled 11 women with ligatures of their own clothing had strangled himself with prison bedding, creating a grotesque symmetry that seemed to close the circle of his violent life. The Jack Unterweger case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how society's best impulses, the belief in redemption, the value of art, the possibility of human transformation, can be exploited by those who understand the psychology of trust and manipulation. His story reveals uncomfortable truths about the way criminal justice systems handle charismatic offenders and the media's role in creating platforms for sophisticated predators. The women Jack murdered, Blanka Bokova, Heide Marie Hammerer, Elfriede Schrempf, Sylvia Zagler, Sabine Moitzi, Regina Prem, Karin Eroglu-Scharfetter, and his American victims Shannon Exley, Irene Rodriguez, and Sherry Long, along with his original victim Margaret Schaefer, represented society's most vulnerable members. They were women whose disappearances didn't trigger immediate alarm, whose deaths were initially attributed to the general dangers of their circumstances rather than to predatory behavior. Jack's ability to exploit these social blind spots reveals systemic failures that extend far beyond his individual pathology. Perhaps most chilling is the realization that Jack's literary talents were genuine. His books remain powerful works that offer authentic insights into the criminal mind and the experience of violence. This creates an ethical dilemma for readers and critics. How do we evaluate art created by someone who used artistic success to facilitate murder? Can we separate the value of his insights from the horror of how he acquired them? The case also raises questions about the role of media in creating celebrity criminals and the way society's fascination with reformed bad boys can provide cover for ongoing predatory behavior. Jack understood that his story of redemption through literature was irresistible to journalists and intellectuals who wanted to believe in the possibility of human transformation. He crafted his public persona with the same precision he brought to his murders, understanding exactly what his audience wanted to hear and giving it to them with consummate skill. In the decades since Jack's death, his case has been studied by criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists trying to understand how someone could maintain such a complete double life for so long. The consensus that has emerged suggests that Jack represents a particularly dangerous type of psychopath, one who combines the traditional traits of lack of empathy and need for control with exceptional intelligence and social skills. His ability to compartmentalize his criminal behavior while genuinely engaging with literature and ideas made him almost impossible to detect using conventional profiling methods. The investigation that ultimately brought him down succeeded not because of superior detective work, but because of the kind of cross-jurisdictional communication that was rare in the early 1990s. Had the murders remained in separate jurisdictions, or had the bureaucratic coincidence that connected the Austrian and American cases not occurred, Jack might have continued killing indefinitely. This realization has led to significant improvements in information sharing between police forces and the development of databases that can identify patterns across multiple jurisdictions. Jack's story also highlights the importance of treating crimes against marginalized populations with the same urgency and resources devoted to victims from more privileged backgrounds. The initial slow pace of the investigation into the prostitute murders created the conditions that allowed Jack to kill multiple women before being detected. Only when the pattern became undeniable and the international connections were discovered did the investigation receive the attention and resources necessary to identify the killer. The psychological complexity of Jack's case continues to fascinate experts in criminal behavior. He wasn't a simple fraud pretending to be reformed. He genuinely believed in his own literary abilities and saw himself as an important voice in discussions of crime and justice. His writings about rehabilitation and redemption contained authentic insights drawn from his experience of imprisonment and violence. This combination of genuine talent with active criminality created a psychological profile that defied easy categorization and made him particularly dangerous. The women who died at Jack's hands were more than just victims. They were individuals with their own stories, dreams, and connections to others who mourned their loss. Blanka Bokova had fled communist Czechoslovakia, seeking a better life in the West. Heide Marie Hammerer was supporting 2 young children through sex work. Shannon Exley had come to Los Angeles with dreams of acting success. Each woman's death represented not just the end of a life, but the destruction of potential futures and the devastating impact on families and communities. Jack Unterweger's legacy is ultimately one of betrayal of the trust placed in him by those who believed in his redemption, betrayal of the women who trusted him enough to get in his car, and betrayal of society's faith in the possibility of human transformation. His case serves as a stark reminder that evil can disguise itself in the most appealing forms, that intelligence and artistic ability are not incompatible with predatory behavior, and that our best impulses toward forgiveness and second chances can be exploited by those who understand the psychology of manipulation. The story of Jack Unterweger remains relevant today as societies continue to grapple with questions of criminal justice reform, the treatment of marginalized populations, and the role of media in creating platforms for dangerous individuals. His case provides sobering lessons about the need for vigilance, the importance of protecting vulnerable populations, and the recognition that some individuals may be beyond the reach of rehabilitation and redemption. In the end, the most fitting memorial to his victims may be the knowledge gained from studying his crimes, knowledge that might help prevent future tragedies and protect others from predators who wear the mask of respectability while harboring the darkest of intentions. The alphabet killers of Alpine Manor. The oxygen machine hummed its mechanical lullaby in the sterile corridors of Alpine Manor nursing home as the night shift began on January 18th, 1987. In the dim amber glow of hallway lights, 2 figures moved with practiced efficiency between the rooms. Catherine May Wood, 24, tall and commanding with her auburn hair pulled back in regulation style, and Gwendolyn Graham, 23, petite and blonde with an easy smile that had charmed residents and staff alike since her arrival 6 months earlier. To anyone observing their routine that cold Michigan evening, they appeared to be model caregivers, dedicated to the elderly residents who had been entrusted to their care. What no one could have imagined was that these two women, bound together by an increasingly toxic romantic obsession, were about to embark on one of the most chilling murder sprees in American healthcare history. A calculated killing game that would claim 5 innocent lives and expose the dark underbelly of institutional care for America's most vulnerable population. Catherine Wood had arrived at Alpine Manor in Walker, Michigan, carrying the weight of a troubled past that seemed to follow her like a shadow. Born in 1962 to a working-class family in Grand Rapids, she had grown up feeling different, isolated, struggling with her sexual identity in a conservative community where such questions were rarely discussed openly. Her marriage to Ken Wood at age 19 had been an attempt at normalcy, but the union was strained from the beginning. Ken, a steady but unremarkable man who worked in construction, couldn't understand his wife's increasingly erratic behavior, her mood swings, or her growing distance from their conventional suburban life. The job at Alpine Manor had initially seemed like a lifeline for Catherine. As a nurse's aide, she found purpose in caring for others, and the work provided structure to her chaotic emotional life. The facility itself was a sprawling, single-story building that housed 230 residents, most suffering from various stages of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and other conditions that left them dependent on round-the-clock care. It was here, among the forgotten elderly, that Catherine first felt she had found her calling. Everything changed when Gwendolyn Graham walked through the doors of Alpine Manor in August 1986. Where Catherine was intense and brooding, Gwen was vivacious and outgoing. She had grown up in Tyler, Texas, the daughter of a military family that had instilled in her a sense of discipline and order. Unlike Catherine, Gwen had no apparent history of psychological troubles. She was simply a young woman who had moved to Michigan to start fresh, leaving behind a broken engagement and seeking new opportunities in the North. The attraction between the two women was immediate and electric. Catherine, who had struggled with her sexuality throughout her marriage, found herself drawn to Gwen's confidence and charisma. For Gwen, Catherine represented something darker and more thrilling than anything she had experienced in her relatively sheltered life. Within weeks of Gwen's arrival, they had begun a clandestine affair that would consume both their lives. Their relationship unfolded against the backdrop of Alpine Manor's night shifts, where minimal supervision and reduced staffing created an environment where secrets could flourish. The facility, like many nursing homes across America in the 1980s, operated on thin margins and relied heavily on underpaid, overworked staff to maintain basic care standards. Background checks were minimal, psychological evaluations non-existent, and the chronic understaffing meant that two people working together could easily avoid scrutiny. As autumn turned to winter in 1986, the relationship between Catherine and Gwen deepened into something far more dangerous than simple romance. Catherine, desperate to prove her love and maintain Gwen's interest, began to suggest increasingly extreme demonstrations of their bond. She spoke of wanting to do something that would tie them together forever, something that would prove their relationship was special, different from anything either had experienced before. It was during one of their late-night conversations in December 1986 that Catherine first broached the unthinkable. What if they killed someone together? The idea, she suggested, would be the ultimate expression of their love, a secret so profound that it would bind them eternally. Gwen, initially shocked by the suggestion, found herself drawn into Catherine's twisted logic. The residents of Alpine Manor, Catherine argued, were already suffering, forgotten by their families, living out their final days in confusion and pain. They would be putting them out of their misery while creating an unbreakable bond between themselves. The first murder occurred on January 18th, 1987, in the room of Marguerite Chambers, an 84-year-old woman suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease. Mrs. Chambers had been a school teacher for 40 years before her retirement, a woman who had dedicated her life to nurturing young minds. Now, confused and frightened by her deteriorating condition, she lay helpless in her bed as Catherine and Gwen entered her room during the night shift. Catherine held the elderly woman's arms, while Gwen placed a washcloth over her nose and mouth, pressing down with steady pressure as Mrs. Chambers struggled weakly against the suffocation. The entire act took less than 3 minutes. When it was over, they repositioned the body, removed any evidence of struggle, and calmly returned to their rounds. The death was recorded as natural causes, another elderly resident who had passed peacefully in her sleep. The murder had been easier than either woman had imagined, and the rush of power and secrecy proved intoxicating. More disturbing still was Catherine's reaction to the killing. Rather than feeling remorse or horror, she experienced a surge of sexual excitement and emotional connection to Gwen that surpassed anything she had felt before. For Catherine, the murder had been an act of ultimate intimacy, a crossing of boundaries that elevated their relationship to something transcendent. But Catherine's obsession went beyond simple killing. In her twisted mind, she devised a game that would make their murders even more meaningful. They would kill residents whose first names began with letters that would eventually spell out Murder. The plan gave their crimes a sense of purpose and creativity that appealed to Catherine's need for control and significance. 3 weeks later, on February 11th, 1987, they claimed their second victim. Maud Holt, 95 years old, had been a seamstress for most of her adult life, known for her intricate quilting work that had won prizes at county fairs throughout western Michigan. She had no living relatives and few visitors, making her an ideal target for Catherine and Gwen's deadly game. Like Mrs. Chambers, she was suffocated with a washcloth during the night shift, her death attributed to natural causes by the attending physician, who had grown accustomed to the steady stream of elderly deaths at the facility. The pattern continued with methodical precision. On March 1st, 1987, Mae Mason, 79, became their third victim. Mrs. Mason had been a librarian in Grand Rapids for 30 years, a woman who had spent her life organizing knowledge and helping others find information. She had been at Alpine Manor for only 6 months, placed there by her nephew after a series of falls had made independent living impossible. Her suffocation followed the same pattern as the previous murders, with Catherine and Gwen working together to ensure a quick, quiet death that would attract no suspicion. By the spring of 1987, Catherine and Gwen had established a routine that went far beyond their murderous activities. They spent their off hours together, with Catherine often staying at Gwen's apartment, spinning elaborate fantasies about their future together. Catherine spoke of leaving her husband and starting a new life with Gwen, perhaps moving to another state where they could be together openly. But beneath Catherine's romantic delusions lay a growing desperation. She sensed that Gwen was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with their crimes and their relationship, and she feared losing the only person who had ever made her feel truly alive. The fourth murder occurred on April 24th, 1987, claiming the life of Edith Cole, 89, a former factory worker who had raised 6 children as a single mother during the Depression. Mrs. Cole had been known for her fierce independence and sharp wit, qualities that had sustained her through decades of hardship. Her death, like the others, was officially attributed to natural causes, but Catherine and Gwen had been forced to work harder to subdue her, as she had retained more physical strength than their previous victims. As summer approached, the relationship between Catherine and Gwen began to show signs of strain. Gwen, who had initially been swept up in Catherine's fantasies and the excitement of their secret crimes, was beginning to experience guilt and anxiety about their actions. She started avoiding Catherine outside of work, making excuses to spend time alone or with other friends. Catherine, sensing her partner's withdrawal, became increasingly desperate and controlling, alternating between romantic gestures and veiled threats about what would happen if Gwen tried to leave her. The final murder in their deadly game took place on July 31st, 1987. The victim was Ruth Van Dyke, 70, the youngest of their targets, and the one whose death would ultimately prove most difficult to explain as natural causes. Mrs. Van Dyke had been a nurse herself before her retirement, and she had been placed at Alpine Manor following a stroke that had left her partially paralysed but mentally alert. Her medical background made her more aware of her surroundings than the other victims, and her death required more violence to accomplish. Catherine and Gwen entered Mrs. Van Dyke's room during the night shift, but unlike their previous victims, she was awake and alert when they approached her bed. She recognised immediately that something was wrong and tried to call for help, but Catherine quickly clamped her hand over the elderly woman's mouth while Gwen pressed a pillow over her face. Mrs. Van Dyke fought harder than any of their previous victims, her nursing training having taught her to recognise the signs of deliberate suffocation. The struggle lasted nearly 10 minutes before she finally succumbed, leaving both women shaken and exhausted. The murder of Ruth Van Dyke marked a turning point in their relationship. Gwen, horrified by the violence required to kill someone who had fought so hard to live, began to withdraw completely from Catherine. She started calling in sick to work, avoiding the night shifts they had worked together, and when she did show up, she was distant and preoccupied. Catherine, realizing that her hold over Gwen was slipping, became increasingly unstable and possessive. By the fall of 1987, their relationship had deteriorated to the point where they were barely speaking. Gwen had begun talking about leaving Alpine Manor, perhaps moving back to Texas, or finding work at another facility. Catherine, faced with the prospect of losing both Gwen and their shared secret, began to unravel psychologically. She started drinking heavily, her work performance suffered, and she became increasingly paranoid that Gwen might confess their crimes to someone else. The end came not through any brilliant police work or suspicious medical examiner, but through the breakdown of their relationship and Catherine's inability to let go. In November 1987, Gwen finally quit her job at Alpine Manor and announced her intention to return to Texas. Catherine, desperate to prevent her departure, began to stalk Gwen, showing up at her apartment unannounced and making increasingly frantic calls, begging her to stay. On December 3, 1987, during what would be their final confrontation, Catherine made a critical error. In her desperation to maintain control over Gwen, she explicitly threatened to expose their crimes if Gwen left Michigan. The threat backfired spectacularly. Rather than keeping Gwen in line, it gave her the final push she needed to break free from Catherine's influence entirely. Gwen moved back to Texas just before Christmas 1987, leaving Catherine alone with their shared secret and her deteriorating mental state. For months, Catherine continued to work at Alpine Manor, but her behaviour became increasingly erratic. She talked to herself during shifts, made inappropriate comments to residents and their families, and began to abuse alcohol more heavily. Her marriage to Ken Wood, already strained by her affair with Gwen, finally collapsed entirely when she moved out of their home and into a small apartment. The investigation that would ultimately bring down Catherine Wood began not with suspicious deaths at Alpine Manor, but with a completely unrelated incident in Grand Rapids. In October 1988, nearly a year after Gwen's departure, Catherine was arrested for allegedly killing Ken Wood's ex-wife, Diane Wood, in a dispute over child custody. The case was ultimately dismissed due to lack of evidence, but during the investigation, Catherine's increasingly unstable behaviour and her obsession with death caught the attention of investigators. Detective James Hoffman of the Grand Rapids Police Department, who had worked the Diane Wood case, became concerned about Catherine's psychological state and her employment at a nursing home. He began to investigate her background more thoroughly and discovered her relationship with Gwendolyn Graham, who had left the area abruptly in late 1987. Hoffman's instincts told him there was more to the story than a simple workplace romance gone wrong. The breakthrough came when Detective Hoffman contacted Gwendolyn Graham in Texas. Initially, Gwen denied any knowledge of wrongdoing at Alpine Manor, but as Hoffman pressed her with questions about the deaths of elderly residents during her time there, her composure began to crack. She had been living with the guilt of the murders for over a year, and the investigation provided an opportunity for confession that she had been both dreading and desperately wanting. On December 4th, 1988, exactly 1 year after her final confrontation with Catherine Wood, Gwendolyn Graham walked into the Tyler, Texas police station and confessed to participating in the murders of 5 elderly residents at Alpine Manor Nursing Home. Her confession was detailed and specific, providing information about dates, methods, and motives that could only have come from someone with direct knowledge of the crimes. Graham's confession sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community in Michigan. The idea that 2 trusted caregivers had been systematically murdering elderly residents for sexual gratification and relationship bonding was almost too horrific to comprehend. But Graham's account was consistent and detailed, and it explained a number of deaths that had occurred during her time at Alpine Manor. Catherine Wood was arrested on December 7, 1988, at her apartment in Grand Rapids. Unlike Gwen, she initially denied any involvement in the murders, claiming that her former lover was making up stories to get revenge for their failed relationship. But as investigators presented her with evidence and testimony from Graham, her story began to change. She admitted to having been present during some of the deaths, but claimed that Gwen had been the primary perpetrator and that she had been coerced into participating. The investigation into the Alpine Manor murders revealed systematic failures in the facility's oversight and management. Background checks on employees were minimal. Supervision during night shifts was practically non-existent, and the deaths of elderly residents were rarely questioned, even when they occurred in clusters. The facility's administration had been more concerned with maintaining their profit margins than ensuring the safety of their residents. Medical examiner Dr. Michael Zars was brought in to review the deaths that had occurred during Wood and Graham's time at Alpine Manor. While the bodies had been cremated or buried, making forensic analysis impossible, Dr. Zars was able to identify patterns in the deaths that were consistent with suffocation. The victims had all died during night shifts when Wood and Graham were working together, and all had been in relatively stable condition before their sudden deaths. The trial of Catherine Wood and Gwendolyn Graham began on June 3, 1989, in Kent County Circuit Court. The case attracted national media attention as one of the first instances of healthcare serial killing to be prosecuted in the United States. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Timothy Verhey, painted a picture of 2 women whose sexual obsession had led them to commit increasingly violent crimes against helpless victims. Graham, who had cooperated with investigators and testified against Wood, was portrayed as a follower who had been manipulated by her older, more psychologically disturbed partner. Her testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, as she provided detailed accounts of each murder and the planning that had gone into them. She described how Wood had conceived the MURDER game and how she had been gradually drawn into participating in the crimes. Wood's defense team, led by attorney James Piersma, attempted to portray their client as a victim of Graham's manipulation, arguing that she had been coerced into participating in the murders through psychological abuse and threats. They painted Graham as the true mastermind of the crimes, claiming that she had fabricated the story about Wood's leadership role in order to receive a more lenient sentence. The trial revealed disturbing details about the relationship between Wood and Graham and the psychological dynamics that had led to their killing spree. expert witnesses testified about the phenomenon of folie à deux, or shared psychosis, in which two people feed off each other's delusions and engage in increasingly extreme behaviour. The murders at Alpine Manor, they argued, were the result of a toxic relationship in which both women had lost touch with reality and moral boundaries. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the testimony about how the murders had been planned and executed. Graham described how they had selected victims based on their vulnerability and isolation, choosing residents who had few visitors and whose deaths would be least likely to attract attention. The MURDER game, she testified, had been Wood's idea, designed to make their crimes more meaningful and create a stronger bond between them. The prosecution also presented evidence of Wood's psychological instability and her obsession with death and violence. Friends and co-workers testified about her increasingly erratic behaviour in the months leading up to the murders, her fascination with true crime stories, and her inappropriate comments about death and dying. They painted a picture of a woman who had been struggling with her identity and mental health long before she met Graham. On September 28, 1989, after deliberating for 3 days, the jury found Catherine Wood guilty of second-degree murder in the deaths of 5 elderly residents. She was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 20 years. Gwendolyn Graham, who had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for her cooperation, was sentenced to 5 to 40 years in prison. The Alpine Manor murders had a profound impact on the nursing home industry and healthcare regulation in Michigan and across the United States. New laws were passed requiring more extensive background checks for healthcare workers, better supervision of night shifts, and more rigorous investigation of deaths in nursing homes. The case also led to increased awareness of the potential for abuse in institutional care settings and the need for better protection of vulnerable populations. The families of the victims, many of whom had never suspected that their loved ones had been murdered, were devastated by the revelation that the people entrusted with their care had instead taken their lives. Civil lawsuits were filed against Alpine Manor and its parent company, alleging negligent supervision and failure to protect residents from dangerous employees. The facility eventually closed in 1992, unable to recover from the scandal and the financial burden of the legal proceedings. Catherine Wood served 15 years in prison before being released on parole in 2004. She has maintained a low profile since her release, living quietly in Michigan under strict supervision. Gwendolyn Graham was released in 2006 after serving 17 years of her sentence. She returned to Texas, where she has reportedly worked in non-healthcare positions and avoided public attention. The case of Catherine Wood and Gwendolyn Graham remains one of the most disturbing examples of healthcare serial killing in American history. It exposed the vulnerability of elderly residents in nursing homes and the potential for abuse when proper oversight and safeguards are not in place. The murders at Alpine Manor serve as a stark reminder that those entrusted with caring for society's most vulnerable members must be held to the highest standards of professional and moral conduct. The psychological dynamics of the case continue to fascinate criminologists and mental health professionals. The relationship between Wood and Graham demonstrates how toxic relationships can escalate into extreme violence, particularly when combined with access to vulnerable victims and minimal oversight. Their case has been studied as an example of how sexual obsession, psychological manipulation, and institutional failure can combine to create conditions where serial murder becomes possible. Today, the Alpine Manor murders are remembered as a cautionary tale about the importance of protecting vulnerable populations and maintaining vigilant oversight of those entrusted with their care. The 5 elderly victims, Marguerite Chambers, Maud Holt, Mae Mason, Edith Cole, and Ruth Van Dyke, are remembered not as letters in a twisted spelling game, but as human beings whose lives were cut short by the ultimate betrayal of trust. Their deaths led to meaningful reforms in healthcare oversight and serve as a lasting reminder of the sacred responsibility that comes with caring for those who cannot protect themselves. The Beast of Two Nations. The humid Colombian air hung thick with anticipation on that sweltering afternoon in January 1974, as 29-year-old Daniel Camargo Barbosa adjusted his tie and smoothed his dark hair in the cracked mirror of his cramped Bogotá apartment. To any passerby on the bustling streets below, he appeared unremarkable. A lean man of average height with penetrating dark eyes and the carefully groomed appearance of someone desperately trying to project respectability. What they couldn't see was the storm brewing behind those eyes, a tempest of rage and sexual deviance that would soon unleash itself across two nations, leaving a trail of 72 young lives extinguished in its wake. The transformation of Daniel Camargo from troubled child to one of South America's most prolific serial killers didn't happen overnight. Born on January 22nd, 1930, in the small Colombian town of Abrego, Norte de Santander, Daniel entered a world already scarred by violence and instability. His father, a domineering man prone to explosive outbursts, ruled their household with an iron fist that frequently connected with young Daniel's face. His mother, overwhelmed and beaten down by her husband's brutality, offered little protection for her son, creating a toxic environment where love was scarce and violence was the primary form of communication. The scars of his childhood ran deeper than the physical marks left by his father's beatings. Psychological evaluations conducted years later would reveal a pattern of early trauma that forensic psychiatrists now recognize as a classic precursor to violent criminal behavior. Daniel's formative years were marked by emotional neglect, physical abuse, and a complete absence of stable male role models. By age 8, he had begun exhibiting the warning signs that criminal psychologists call the homicidal triad: bedwetting well past the normal age, cruelty to animals, and an obsession with fire setting. The Camargo family's poverty only compounded Daniel's psychological wounds. They moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough for the boy to form meaningful relationships or find stability. This constant upheaval created in Daniel a profound sense of rootlessness that would later manifest in his nomadic killing spree across international borders. His academic performance suffered as well, and by age 14, he had dropped out of school entirely, taking to the streets where he learned that violence was not just a family trait, but a survival mechanism. As Daniel entered adolescence, his psychological development took an even darker turn. The combination of severe childhood trauma, social isolation, and emerging sexual urges created a perfect storm of dysfunction. He began stalking young women in his neighborhood, following them home and fantasizing about control and domination. These early voyeuristic behaviors, documented in police reports from the 1950s, would prove to be the precursor to the sexual violence that would define his later crimes. By 1950, 20-year-old Daniel had already served his first stint in prison for attempted rape, a crime that shocked his small community but served as an ominous preview of what was to come. The Colombian penal system of the 1950s offered little in the way of rehabilitation or psychological treatment. Instead of addressing the root causes of his violent behavior, incarceration only served to harden Daniel's resolve and refine his criminal methodology. He emerged from prison more dangerous than when he entered, having learned from other inmates how to avoid capture and how to target the most vulnerable members of society. The 1960s found Daniel moving between various jobs: construction worker, street vendor, occasional laborer. But his employment history was erratic and marked by frequent conflicts with supervisors and co-workers. Those who knew him described a man who seemed perpetually angry, quick to take offense, and prone to disturbing outbursts. Women, in particular, seemed to trigger his rage. Former co-workers would later tell investigators that Daniel frequently made crude comments about female passers-by and expressed violent fantasies that made even hardened construction workers uncomfortable. It was during this period that Daniel began to develop the modus operandi that would characterize his killing spree. He would approach young women, often teenagers or women in their early 20s, presenting himself as helpful and trustworthy. His targets were almost invariably from lower socioeconomic backgrounds: girls walking alone to work, students from poor families, young women who had few resources and whose disappearances might not be immediately investigated by overwhelmed and underfunded police departments. The first confirmed murder attributed to Daniel Camargo occurred on March 15, 1974, though investigators believe he may have been killing for months or even years before this date. 17-year-old Maria Elena Villanueva was walking home from her job at a textile factory in Bogotá when she encountered Daniel near a bus stop. Witnesses later recalled seeing a well-dressed man speaking with the young woman, but in the chaotic urban environment of 1970s Bogotá, such interactions barely registered. Maria Elena's body was discovered 3 days later in a vacant lot on the outskirts of the city. The crime scene told a horrific story of prolonged torture and sexual assault. Dr. Eduardo Vargas, the forensic pathologist who conducted the autopsy, would later describe it as one of the most brutal crimes he had encountered in his 20-year career. The victim had been subjected to extensive sexual violence before being strangled with her own clothing. The killer had taken his time, suggesting a level of sadistic pleasure that went far beyond mere murder. What made Maria Elena's case particularly significant was the physical evidence left behind. Unlike many serial killers who become more careful over time, Daniel seemed almost careless in his early crimes. Fingerprints were found on the victim's purse, hair fibers were recovered from her clothing, and most importantly, semen samples were preserved that would later prove crucial in linking him to additional crimes. However, the Colombian National Police's forensic capabilities in 1974 were limited, and much of this evidence sat in storage for years before advanced DNA testing became available. The investigation into Maria Elena's murder was hampered by the same factors that would allow Daniel to continue killing for more than a decade. Colombian law enforcement in the 1970s was overwhelmed by political violence, drug-related crime, and general civil unrest. The murder of a poor factory worker, while tragic, simply didn't command significant resources. Detective Carlos Mendoza, who was assigned to the case, would later admit in interviews that he had over 40 active homicide cases at the time and little hope of solving most of them. This lack of investigative pressure only emboldened Daniel. Within 2 months of Maria Elena's murder, he struck again. 19-year-old Carmen Rodriguez disappeared while walking to her job as a domestic worker in an affluent Bogotá neighborhood. Her body was found a week later, bearing the same signature signs of prolonged torture and sexual assault. The similarities between the two crimes were obvious to investigators, but the concept of serial killing was still relatively new to Colombian law enforcement, and the resources to conduct a proper pattern analysis simply didn't exist. As Daniel's confidence grew, so did the frequency of his attacks. By the end of 1974, at least 6 young women had fallen victim to his increasingly refined methodology. He had learned to target women who were less likely to be immediately missed: runaway teenagers, young women from troubled families, those who lived on the margins of society. He also began to vary his hunting grounds, moving between different neighborhoods and even different cities to avoid detection. The psychological profile that would eventually emerge from Daniel's capture painted a picture of a highly organized killer who planned his attacks meticulously. Unlike disorganized serial killers who act on impulse, Daniel would often stalk his victims for days or weeks before making his move. He studied their routines, identified when they would be most vulnerable, and selected locations where he could commit his crimes without interruption. This level of planning, combined with his superficial charm and ability to appear non-threatening, made him particularly dangerous. By 1975, Daniel had expanded his hunting territory beyond Bogotá, traveling to smaller Colombian cities where police resources were even more limited. The cities of Barranquilla, Cartagena, and Medellin all experienced clusters of similar murders. Young women abducted, sexually assaulted, tortured, and killed. The lack of communication between different police departments meant that these crimes were being investigated in isolation, with no one recognizing the growing pattern. Detective Ana Lucia Santos of the Medellin Police Department was among the first investigators to suspect that they were dealing with a serial killer. Her careful analysis of crime scene evidence and victim profiles revealed striking similarities between murders across multiple jurisdictions. However, her attempts to coordinate with other departments were met with bureaucratic resistance and skepticism from male colleagues who questioned whether a woman could properly analyze such violent crimes. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. In November 1975, 18-year-old Patricia Morales managed to escape from Daniel during an attempted abduction in Medellin. Her detailed description of her attacker and his vehicle provided investigators with their first solid lead. Patricia's testimony revealed Daniel's modus operandi in chilling detail: how he had approached her at a bus stop, claimed to be a taxi driver offering a free ride, and then attempted to force her into his car when she declined. Patricia's escape was nothing short of miraculous. As Daniel attempted to drag her into his vehicle, she managed to break free and run toward a group of construction workers who had heard her screams. The workers chased Daniel's car, managing to record a partial license plate number that would prove crucial to the investigation. More importantly, Patricia's survival provided investigators with a living witness who could identify the killer. The police sketch based on Patricia's description was circulated throughout Colombia, but Daniel had already anticipated the increased heat. By December 1975, he had crossed the border into Ecuador, where he would continue his killing spree in a new country, with different law enforcement agencies that had no knowledge of his crimes in Colombia. Ecuador in the mid-1970s was experiencing its own period of political and social upheaval. The military government was struggling to maintain order while dealing with economic instability and growing social unrest. This chaotic environment provided Daniel with perfect cover for his criminal activities. The Ecuadorian National Police were focused primarily on political dissidents and drug trafficking, leaving little resources for investigating what appeared to be isolated murders of young women. Daniel's first confirmed kill in Ecuador occurred in January 1976, just weeks after crossing the border. 20-year-old Esperanza Valdez was working as a street vendor in Quito when she encountered Daniel, who had assumed a false identity and was presenting himself as a traveling businessman. Esperanza's murder bore all the hallmarks of Daniel's Colombian crimes: prolonged torture, sexual assault, and the killer's signature method of strangulation. The Ecuadorian phase of Daniel's killing spree would prove to be even more prolific than his Colombian crimes. Over the next 8 years, he would murder at least 43 women across Ecuador, moving constantly between cities and adapting his methods to local conditions. His victims ranged in age from 14 to 25, with the majority being teenagers from impoverished backgrounds who were working to support their families. Dr. Roberto Calderon, a criminal psychologist who would later study Daniel's case extensively, identified several factors that made Ecuador particularly conducive to his crimes. The country's mountainous terrain provided numerous isolated locations where bodies could be disposed of without detection. The economic situation forced many young women to work dangerous jobs or travel alone, increasing their vulnerability. Most importantly, the lack of coordination between Ecuador's various police departments meant that patterns of similar crimes went unrecognized for years. Daniel's methodology continued to evolve during his time in Ecuador. He began using multiple false identities, carrying forged documents that allowed him to travel freely throughout the country. He also started varying his killing methods, sometimes using knives instead of strangulation, and occasionally disposing of bodies in rivers or remote mountain locations where they might never be found. This adaptability demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that made him particularly difficult to catch. The investigation into the Ecuadorian murders was led by Inspector Miguel Herrera of the Quito Police Department, a veteran investigator who had previously worked on several high-profile cases. Herrera was among the first to recognize that Ecuador was dealing with a serial killer, but his attempts to coordinate a multi-jurisdictional investigation were hampered by political infighting and resource limitations. Like his Colombian counterparts, Herrera found himself overwhelmed by the scope of the crimes and frustrated by the lack of institutional support. By 1980, Daniel had killed at least 60 women across 2 countries, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in South American history. Yet he remained virtually unknown to the general public, his crimes hidden behind a wall of jurisdictional confusion and investigative incompetence. The lack of media attention also worked in his favor. Unlike serial killers in more developed countries, who might face intense press scrutiny, Daniel operated in relative anonymity. The beginning of the end for Daniel Camargo came in 1983, when advances in forensic science finally began to catch up with his crimes. Colombian authorities had begun using computerized databases to track crime patterns, and Detective Carlos Mendoza, who had never forgotten the Maria Elena Villanueva case, was among the first to recognize the potential connections between murders across multiple jurisdictions and even international borders. Working with limited resources but unlimited determination, Mendoza began building what would become known as the Camargo File, a comprehensive analysis of over 100 unsolved murders of young women across Colombia and Ecuador that bore similar characteristics. His work was painstaking and largely unrecognized by his superiors, but it would eventually provide the foundation for the international manhunt that would bring Daniel to justice. The breakthrough came in March 1986, when Daniel made a crucial mistake. While operating in the Ecuadorian city of Guayaquil, he attempted to abduct 21-year-old Rosa Martinez outside a movie theater. Rosa's boyfriend, who had been waiting for her nearby, witnessed the attempted kidnapping and managed to follow Daniel's car to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. His quick call to police resulted in Daniel's capture while he was in the act of torturing his intended victim. The arrest scene was chaotic and nearly resulted in Daniel's escape. Officer Luis Ramirez, the first policeman to arrive at the warehouse, later described finding Daniel standing over Rosa Martinez, who was bound and partially clothed but still alive. Daniel's initial reaction was to claim that he was the victim of a setup, that Rosa was his girlfriend, and their activities were consensual. However, the presence of torture implements and Rosa's obvious injuries made such claims impossible to sustain. The interrogation of Daniel Camargo would last for weeks and would eventually result in confessions to 72 murders across Colombia and Ecuador. The process was led by a joint team of Colombian and Ecuadorian investigators, marking the first successful international cooperation on a serial killer case in South American history. Dr. Patricia Ruiz, a forensic psychologist brought in to assist with the interrogation, described Daniel as one of the most manipulative and dangerous individuals she had ever encountered. During his confessions, Daniel displayed a chilling lack of remorse for his crimes. He described his victims not as human beings, but as objects that had served their purpose in fulfilling his sexual fantasies. He provided detailed descriptions of torture methods and explained how he had refined his techniques over the years to maximize his victims' suffering. Most disturbingly, he expressed regret not for the lives he had taken, but for his capture, which he viewed as an interruption of his work. The investigation that followed Daniel's confession was the largest criminal investigation in South American history to that point. Teams of investigators from both Colombia and Ecuador worked to verify his claims, exhume bodies, and provide closure to families who had spent years wondering about the fate of their daughters and sisters. The process was emotionally devastating for all involved as the true scope of Daniel's crimes became apparent. Dr. Eduardo Vargas, the forensic pathologist who had conducted the autopsy on Daniel's first confirmed victim 12 years earlier, found himself examining evidence from dozens of additional cases. His final report documented a pattern of escalating violence that painted a picture of a killer who had grown more sadistic and more skilled over time. The physical evidence supported Daniel's confessions in every verifiable case, removing any doubt about his guilt. The trial of Daniel Camargo began in November 1986 and quickly became a media sensation throughout South America. For the first time, the public learned the full extent of his crimes and the systemic failures that had allowed him to kill for over a decade. Families of victims filled the courtroom each day, many seeing their daughter's killer for the first time. The emotional weight of their testimony provided a stark contrast to Daniel's cold, calculated demeanor. The prosecution, led by Attorney General Carmen Delgado, presented overwhelming evidence of Daniel's guilt. In addition to his detailed confessions, they had physical evidence linking him to multiple crime scenes, witness testimony from survivors like Patricia Morales, and expert psychological testimony explaining his criminal behavior. The defense, faced with such overwhelming evidence, could only argue for life imprisonment rather than the death penalty. The psychological evaluation of Daniel Camargo conducted during his trial provided crucial insights into the mind of a serial killer. Dr. Roberto Calderon's analysis revealed a complex individual whose crimes were driven by a combination of childhood trauma, sexual deviance, and a profound hatred of women. The report noted that Daniel showed classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, sexual sadism, and psychopathy, a combination that made rehabilitation impossible and future violence inevitable. On February 15, 1987, Daniel Camargo was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence was to be served in Colombia's maximum security La Picota prison, where he would be isolated from other inmates for his own protection. The verdict brought a measure of closure to the families of his victims, though many expressed frustration that their legal systems did not allow for the death penalty. Daniel's imprisonment marked the end of one of South America's most notorious killing sprees, but it also exposed serious flaws in regional law enforcement capabilities. The investigation revealed that improved communication between police departments, better forensic resources, and more attention to crimes against women might have prevented many of the murders. These lessons would lead to significant reforms in how serial crimes are investigated across South America. The impact of Daniel Camargo's crimes extended far beyond his individual victims. His case highlighted the vulnerability of young women from impoverished backgrounds and the systemic issues that made them easy targets for predators. Advocacy groups used his trial as a platform to demand better protection for women and more resources for investigating crimes against vulnerable populations. Daniel Camargo died in prison on November 8, 1994, at the age of 64. His death from natural causes denied many victims' families the satisfaction of seeing him suffer for his crimes, but it also ended any possibility that he might one day escape and kill again. His legacy remains one of the darkest chapters in South American criminal history, a reminder of the evil that can flourish when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. The case files of Daniel Camargo's crimes now serve as teaching tools for law enforcement agencies throughout Latin America. His methodical approach to killing, his ability to evade capture across international borders, and the investigative techniques that finally brought him to justice are studied by police academies and criminal justice programs across the region. The 72 lives he destroyed serve as a permanent reminder of the importance of international cooperation in fighting crime and the need for society to take seriously the threat posed by serial predators. Today, memorials in both Colombia and Ecuador honor the memory of Daniel Camargo's victims, young women whose lives were cut short by a monster who viewed their deaths as nothing more than entertainment. Their stories serve as a call to action for improved law enforcement, better protection for vulnerable populations, and a justice system that treats all victims with equal importance, regardless of their social or economic status. In death, these women achieved something they never had in life: a voice that continues to speak for justice and protection for those who come after them.